with Joe Biden federal law, ignoring federal law, and giving a multi-billion-dollar gift to Putin. Suddenly, the Democrats who've given all these speeches on Russia, who passed CAATSA, I talked earlier about CAATSA, the legislation that imposes mandatory sanctions on Russia to stop a president who refuses to impose those sanctions. Well, Joe Biden is in defiance of CAATSA. Do you see a single Democrat standing up saying, Mr. President, obey CAATSA? Nope. They're whining that the Deputy Assistant Undersecretary of whatchamacallit has not been confirmed yesterday. And clearly the world is going to come to an end without a Deputy Assistant of whatchamacallit. If our Democratic colleagues believed their rhetoric of the last 4 years, we would see Democrats stand up with me and say, Joe Biden's multi-billion-dollar gift to Putin is a mistake. But they're not. One of the ironies, in addition to the Russia thing, and the truth of the matter is, most of the Democrats never believed Russia. If you go back to the Soviet Union, if you go back to the Reagan administration, Democrats had spent decades as apologists for Soviet communists, as apologists for Russian dictators. But for 4 years, I got to say, our Democratic colleagues can give a good speech. They sure sounded genuine when they said Russia. But if they believed those words, then they would look at Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and they'd say Russia. Because, by the way, I didn't like Donald Trump's rhetoric on Russia. And by the way, I didn't like a lot of the things President Trump said on Russia. I wish his rhetoric had been stronger. But it's worth noting, Trump had the courage to call out Germany for Nord Stream 2. Trump had the courage to impose sanctions under the bipartisan sanctions legislation we passed into law, the Cruz-Shaheen legislation passed in 2019, and the second wave of Cruz-Shaheen bipartisan legislation passed in 2020. President Trump imposed. What did Joe Biden do? Waived it. What did Joe Biden do? Ignored the law. What did Joe Biden do? Give a multi-billion-dollar gift to Putin. So if any Democrat meant a word they said about Russia, we ought to see them standing here. You will note the Democratic side of the floor is largely empty. But not only is Joe Biden's rhetoric and the Democrats' rhetoric on Russia not matched by their action, but we also know that Biden's actions don't meet the Democrats' rhetoric on climate. Now, what I want to address now is environmentalism and climate, which President Biden and the left tells us are existential issues. There is nothing mattering more, they say, than climate change. That if we don't fight climate change, Nebraska is going to be underwater, they tell us. They say we need to follow the example of our European allies in agreements like the Paris Accords. But the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will grind any European energy transition to a halt by making the Europeans even more dependent on Russian gas. Now, some proponents have argued that the natural gas delivered by Nord Stream 2 would be kind of a transition technology. But the German Institute for Economic Research's senior energy expert described Nord Stream 2 on these issues as, quote, unnecessary and inefficient. More analysis, published again just last week, projected that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would emit over 100 million metric tons of CO2 per year, plus fugitive methane. The gas that Nord Stream 2 would deliver compares very badly to the alternative, and that is LNG, liquid natural gas. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Energy's National Energy Technology Lab published a study showing that U.S. LNG shipped to European markets has 41% less life cycle emissions than if those same countries were to receive natural gas from another predominant producer like Russia. Mr. President, listen to that again, because our Democratic colleagues love to pound the table how carbon is the greatest threat on the planet. Well, Joe Biden is saddling Europe with an energy option that produces much more CO2 than American LNG. American LNG, 41% less carbon dioxide. If they believe their rhetoric, you'd see Democrats standing up to Joe Biden. If Joe Biden believed his rhetoric, I guess you'd see Joe Biden standing up to himself. If John Kerry believed his rhetoric, in between his flights on a private jet, where John Kerry has the carbon footprint of a small town, in between his pontificating and lecturing American workers they just need to learn to code, if John Kerry believed climate was this existential disaster, he'd be standing up saying, President Biden, why are you defying Congress, defying the European Union, and giving Putin a multi-billion-dollar gift that produces more CO2? There's no argument from the left or the right under which Nord Stream 2 is a good idea, but especially on the basis of what the left tells us are their most important issues. Russia, 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 it's a disaster on Russia, Russia, Russia. CO2, it's a disaster on CO2. You know, Twitter today is lit up with a certain European teenager who's fond at lecturing the world about insufficient fealty to climate. And she responded to American leaders who, to use her words, say blah, blah, blah when it comes to climate. Mr. President, I got to say, our Democratic colleagues, this Democratic administration, when it comes to Nord Stream 2, their only answer is blah, blah, blah. They don't have an answer that they are resulting in. What was the figure again? Let's actually get that figure right. 100 million metric tons of CO2 per year. Congratulations. The next time you give a speech saying that you want to double Americans' electricity bills, you want to bankrupt working families because of CO2, remember, you didn't seem worried about it when it was the Russians producing the CO2 in a way that hurts Europe, hurts our allies, and hurts America. Look, I get party politics. People want to stand and support their party. I get it. When there's a Republican president, Republicans support them, generally. When there's a Democratic president, Democrats support them, generally. That's the way it works. That's not terribly shocking. But is it asking too much for even one of the Democrats to believe what they've said for the last 5 years? Throughout the course of these remarks, you know who I've quoted more than anyone else? Senate Democrats. I've quoted their own remarks. Senate Democrats understand Nord Stream 2 is a disaster. They understand it's harmful. They understand it's bad for America. Where they just can't screw up the courage is when it comes to standing up to a Democratic president. By the way, they're perfectly happy to yell at Donald Trump. I get that. And to be clear, when we had a Republican president, Donald Trump, I pressed the Trump administration hard on Nord Stream 2, even though we're the same party. I was not remotely shy about pressing the Trump administration. There are 50 Democrats in this chamber. Is there one who believed Russia, Russia, Russia? Or was that all empty politics? Is there one who believes their hyperbolic rhetoric on CO2 and climate? Or is that all just blah, blah, blah? It's real simple. The Biden administration has a chance to fix this. Just this weekend, the German people voted out the Merkel government. The entire reason Joe Biden went down this foolhardy, disastrous path was to kiss up to Angela Merkel. Well, you know what? She's gone. Her party's gone. They're out of power. And so Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been giving a present of the chance to pull victory out of the jaws of defeat. We had victory from 2019 to 2020, where we'd shut down the pipeline. Republicans and Democrats together in Congress had come together and shut down the pipeline. Putin had lost, America had won. Joe Biden comes into office, and now Putin wins, America loses. That ain't good. That ain't good in Michigan. It ain't good in Arizona. It ain't good in any state in this country. And Joe Biden can fix it if he simply accepts the gifts the German voters have given him, reverses course, and follows U.S. law. Let's stop the Biden-Putin pipeline. Let's give an opportunity for President Biden to pull his name off the pipeline. By the way, if he were to do so, I'll come to this floor and I'll sing Joe Biden's praises for doing the right thing, for following the law, for standing up for America, for standing up to Russia, for defending our European allies. But sadly, I'm not holding my breath. I think the hubris of office, stubbornness, is likely to keep the Biden administration digging in. In the Senate, I'm going to use every tool I have to try to press them to change their minds. And I would call on, is there even one Democrat with the courage to take on Russia? Time will tell. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin.
So that goes.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to point out the failures of the Biden administration's foreign policies, and specifically President Biden's failures, in addition to that of his administration. Because President Biden ran for president based on basically two things: what he described as his competence and as his foreign policy expertise. He has failed miserably at both. It's been nearly a month since President Biden withdrew from Afghanistan. And what about the Taliban? Well, right now they are more powerful than ever. They have billions and billions of dollars worth of high-tech military equipment. It's beyond their wildest dreams. Where'd they get the weapons? Well, they got them from the United States of America. As we hear on nightly news broadcasts, and as we know from what we're hearing at home, there are hundreds of Americans still stranded behind enemy lines. The administration doesn't want to admit a number, but there are hundreds of Americans stranded behind enemy lines, if not more. The detrimental consequences for America is only beginning. Our friends are furious, and our enemies, they are emboldened by what has happened in Afghanistan. Earlier this month, I visited with our NATO allies. Our allies are enraged, and a host of foreign policy mistakes by President Biden, in my opinion and in theirs, are irreversible. Here are just a few examples. Angela Merkel's designated successor in Germany called our Afghanistan withdrawal the biggest debacle in the history of NATO. President Biden didn't mind offending our Canadian allies when he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline. Months later, he gave Vladimir Putin the green light to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and we've just heard Senator Cruz talking about that. Remember, this pipeline is a geopolitical weapon that Putin's going to use to hold our European allies hostage. Hostage for money and hostage for energy. President Duda of Poland, he said recently the Nord Stream 2 giveaway is grounds for reflection on relations with the United States. France was so offended with President Biden at one point they recalled their ambassador. Never happened in American history. Go back all the way to the 1700s. France is a nuclear power, as one of our closest allies. This is presidential incompetence on an unprecedented scale. Our allies see the incompetence. Our enemies not only see it, they can smell it. China has said so publicly. Afghanistan shows Americans cannot defend our allies anymore. Now China is threatening Taiwan and building more than 200 missile silos. Iran has accelerated its nuclear program. According to Israel, Iran is only a few weeks away from having enough material to build a nuclear weapon. And on the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, American troops in Iraq were attacked. Russia is preparing to test a nuclear cruise missile near the Arctic Circle. North Korea is expanding uranium enrichment. And just days after America withdrew from Afghanistan, North Korea tested 2 ballistic missiles. In every area and region of the world, our nation, America's interests are in retreat. Our enemies are on the march. America has grown weaker under Joe Biden. Our enemies have grown stronger under Joe Biden. Because of President Biden's incompetence, mismanagement, and weakness, we are all, as citizens of this country, less safe. When I think of the last 8 months, I'm reminded of something that former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said. And remember, he was Secretary of Defense under President Obama. He said, Joe Biden has been wrong. Wrong. Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue of the last 4 decades. 40 years of being wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue. At the time he said that, had been 4 decades. Now, Joe Biden is President of the United States, and it is 5 decades. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent to end the quorum call.
Without objection.
Last week, President Biden went to the United Nations and he announced his capitulation to the Chinese Communist Party. The message was clear from what he did and did not say. In Joe Biden's 30-minute-long monologue on the state of the world, he never once even said the name of the world's greatest threat to peace, stability, and democracy, China. Never said it once. He refused to even say the word China. Nor did he mention Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or practically any of the victims of Chinese communist aggression. Now, President Biden did mention the, quote, targeting and oppression of minorities in Xinjiang province in China's northwest. Yet he left mysteriously vague who's responsible for all that targeting and oppression. He blithely lumped in Xinjiang with other abuses occurring around the world as if it's just one area of deep concern among many. But the concentration camps in Xinjiang are not just another problem. They are proof of the most systematic genocide and ethnic cleansing campaign occurring in the world today, perpetrated by one of the most advanced and powerful regimes on earth, personally approved by the Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping. Leaked documents make it clear that Chairman Xi is responsible for this campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Let me explain how brutal it is. The Chinese Communist Party are sterilizing women in Xinjiang province so they cannot procreate and create more of their ethnic minority. And if they can't do that, then they are being brutally raped by Han Chinese men. That's what's happening in Xinjiang province. In addition to the internment of millions of religious and ethnic minorities. It's not just your run-of-the-mill targeting and oppression. President Biden also referred to China implicitly, since he didn't say the word, on another occasion in a speech when he said that the United States is, quote, not seeking a new Cold War. Of course we're not seeking a war of any kind, cold or hot. That is the last thing the United States would ever want. But still, that's an astonishing assertion, because whether we seek it or not, China has been waging a Cold War on America and our workers and our factories and our militaries and our way of life for decades. The only question is whether we will win or lose. Under President Biden, we're losing. A strong leader, a competent leader, would seek to win this Cold War thrust upon the United States in the manner of those who went before us, facing enemies like Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Soviet Russia. Instead, in the manner of appeasers the world over, President Biden hopes to make peace with China by indulging its aggression, by refusing even to say his name. Now, if you think this is restoring some norm of long-standing provenance, that you don't go to the United Nations General Assembly and speak the name of your adversaries who are committing acts of naked aggression and crimes against humanity, I would point out that Barack Obama repeatedly called out Russia by name in 2014 for its invasion of Ukraine. And let's just say that President Obama was not exactly a Cold Warrior. Now, as a result, Chairman Xi is issuing imperious orders, and the Biden administration is rushing to fill them like a short-order cook at a diner on a Saturday morning. Early in the administration, President Biden lifted restrictions on Confucius Institutes, which are little more than spy outposts on our universities. He gutted Trump-era rules protecting our electrical grid from Chinese influence. And he shut down a State Department investigation into the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus. Then in July, China's foreign minister handed two lists of new demands to Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, stating that the United States must stop so-called wrongdoings in order to get back in Beijing's good graces. Similarly, when the so-called climate czar, John Kerry, asked for China's help, the Communist Party responded that it would consider polluting a little less if the United States would shut up about China's campaign of genocide and other human rights abuses. Now, any self-respecting administration that believes in American strength, pride, and honor would have told Chairman Xi he's in no position to be making such demands. Instead, this administration is going down the page, ticking off boxes like an obedient underling. When a reporter asked John Kerry if the administration would press China on its horrific human rights abuses, Kerry responded that, quote, "Life is always full of tough choices," end quote. Pathetic. Around the same time, Biden's Commerce Secretary called for robust commercial engagement and to mitigate any potential tensions between the United States and China. She even promised to bring delegations of U.S. business leaders to China to pad the communist bottom line even further. She calls to mind what is attributed to Lenin, that capitalists will sell a communist the rope they use to hang us all. Pathetic. Over the weekend, in its most recent act of pathetic weakness, the Biden Department of Justice surrendered Huawei's criminal CFO and princess, Ming Wanzhou, without punishing her for evading U.S. sanctions. She received a hero's welcome when her plane touched down in China, and not only that, moments after her release, China released 2 innocent Canadians that it had taken hostage to secure Ming's release. So Beijing's hostage-taking worked exactly as planned. Pathetic. All of this self-inflicted humiliation was avoidable. The fact is that China is in no position to deliver ultimatums to us. It's America that ought to be making demands to China. Here's just a few things that would actually pave a path to true reconciliation. First and foremost, we ought to demand that China finally admit what almost everyone knows is certainly true, that the coronavirus pandemic started in a lab in Wuhan. Xi Jinping should then give a groveling televised apology to the world, agree to end all gain-of-function research using deadly pathogens, and pay damages to his victims around the world who have died or suffered because of his regime's incompetence and malevolence. Second, we ought to demand that China agree to rebid the 2022 Winter Olympics until the Chinese regime ends its ethnic cleansing, slave labor, mass murder, mass sterilization, and systematic rape of ethnic and religious minorities. It is too morally tainted to host such a prestigious event. Third, we ought to demand that China end its spree of intellectual property theft. Today, China is responsible for up to 80% of the intellectual property theft committed against the United States, and is the subject of nearly half of all FBI counterintelligence cases for economic espionage. This theft has to stop. Fourth, we should demand that China renounce its imperial ambitions. It must agree to stop the Belt and Road Initiative, disclaim its ambition of conquering Taiwan, abide by its treaty obligations regarding Hong Kong, and end its sinister and provocative military buildup. These conditions are met, then China will be on the path to making amends for its many crimes. It's up to America to hold China accountable for these crimes. After all, we are the global leader, not China. We don't require China's forgiveness or favor. Our conscience is clean. Our nation is great. We're the nation that threw off the shackles of an empire, settled a continent, saved a world, and then saved it again and again. The United States has been the greatest enemy of tyranny the world over. We do not cower before tyrants. We look them in the eye and we call them by their true name and tell them what they really are: evil. President Biden ought to remember that the next time he speaks to the world on behalf of the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
All time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? That there appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Bennett. Thank you. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Thank you. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Cantwell, Cardin, Collins, Durbin, Hassan, Hirono, Kelly, King, Merkley, Peters, Schumer, Tester, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cornyn, Cotton, Grassley, Hawley, Johnson, McConnell, Scott of Florida, and Young. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye.